Hi, my name is Dr. Roger Tomhave, and I am a professor emeritus at James Madison University in Harrisonburg, Virginia. And I'm just going to take a moment here to share my screen. So one moment. All right, thank you very much. This presentation is in commemoration of Dr. Laura Hill Chapman. Laura Chapman was one of my mentors for the early days of my Getty training in Los Angeles. And as you might expect, there are many others in art education, and especially those in the NAEA, that mourn her loss and have commemorated her passing. Shortly after her passing, her friend and colleague, Jack Davis, collected the remembrances of Laura, including mine, that had been posted to the NAEA Distinguished Fellow distribution list. He included Laura's obituary, which noted that she had published 36 award-winning books and numerous articles on art education, was a consultant to the National Endowment for the Arts, the J. Paul Getty Trust, the U.S. Department of Education, the College Board, and the Department of Defense Schools. She lectured in over 40 states, Canada, England, Germany, the Netherlands, Australia, and New Zealand, and she prided herself on being honored as a Distinguished Fellow of the National Art Education Association. Jack also included her impressive and voluminous CV, and the 3 nomination letters from himself, Marianne Stankiewicz, and Marilyn Stewart that had accompanied the Elliot Eisner Lifetime Achievement Award Laura received from the NAEA in 2018. You can see the list on the slide viewed now of the most prestigious of Laura's 40 years of NAEA awards. Nancy Walkup, in collaboration with Davis Publications, posted on the Davis website on January 5th, 2022, remembrances of beloved colleagues of Laura Chapman, including mine. Laura was an icon of Davis Publication authors, with such publications as A World of Images, Approaches to Art Education, Adventures in Art, Art, Images and Ideas, and the Discovery Art series for the elementary level. It was in May of 2022, that issue of Art Education magazine, that Marianne Stankiewicz published Becoming and Being an Exemplary Art Educator, Laura Hill Chapman, 1935 to 2021. In Becoming, Laura was influenced by Victor Lowenfeld, Manuel Barkan's A Foundation for Art Education, and John Dewey's Experiential Learning. She was a young art educator at the Penn State Conference of 1965, a large contributor, along with Manny Barkan, to our understanding of the crossroads between aesthetic education and art education. She was a contributor in the early days to the Caucus on Multi-Ethnic Concerns and the Women's Caucus. Her curriculum writing for Davis Publications was grounded in 4 philosophic traditions: classical realism, scientific realism, Deweyan experimentation, and existentialism. An art curriculum should be informed by multiple perspectives, she said. And she had a long-standing interest in policy and the bigger picture of public education. In Being, Laura Chapman was an inspiration to us all. Well, it was at the NAEA conference, spring of 2004, held in Denver, Colorado, that Laura laid out for a packed audience her careful reading and prediction of the federal No Child Left Behind policy. I, as well as many others in the audience, were stunned with her analysis of the legislation, but also for her dire predictions for the future of public education in the United States. And it is that instance which I would like to refer to in detail in this commemoration of Laura. It was in the fall of that same year, as the co-chair of the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Council of Arts Supervisors, based at the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, that I invited Dr. Chapman to make her presentation that she had made in Denver at the Kennedy Center. To the event, we had invited congressmen and women who had voted for the No Child Left Behind legislation, as well as superintendents, school board members, and administrators of the Washington metro area public schools. Aside about the transformation of Laura's overall over-under slide carousel presentation in Denver, what happened was when I invited Laura to come to Washington, D.C., she had said that she had used these over-under slide carousels. And when I checked with the Kennedy Center, they had no way of showing that. They used PowerPoint. So I talked it over with Laura, and Laura mailed to me, her 2 slide carousels and the script. And so it was from her own slides that I created the PowerPoint presentation that she used at the Kennedy Center. And so I still have those. I have the slides, and I also have her transcript of what she said in Denver in relationship to those slides. And I will use it in part in this presentation. Though my regards for Dr. Chapman needed no enhancing when she came to the Kennedy Center, I gained a deep admiration and respect for her boldness in the face of adversity. You see, it was one thing to preach to the choir of art education colleagues at the NAEA National Conference 1,500 miles away in Denver from where NCLB was enacted. And it was quite another to address a general education audience, including legislatures who had voted for the bill in the heart of the nation's capital. So then what follows is a summary of Laura's predictions of NCLB, made both at the Denver and Washington, D.C. Locations, and using many of Laura's own slides. So unlike preaching to the choir of her fellow art educators at the NAEA conference in Denver, at the Kennedy Center, I could tell that Laura was nervous and tenuous as she started. But she warmed to her topic quickly, and by the 4th slide or so, she had come right back to her confident, articulate, and indignant self. So this is one of her first slides, and Laura says with this slide, the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001 reauthorized the Elementary and Secondary Act of 1965 and the 1994 reauthorization known as the Improving American Schools Act. It is important to remember that NCLB had substantial bipartisan support in Congress, and neither political party has proposed major changes, this is Laura in 2004, except tinkering with the funding. It's the most elaborate case of federal micromanagement of state policy, schools, and teachers in the history of American education. Laura's first prediction was that as a result of a focus on basics in No Child Left Behind, there would be a nationwide decrease in arts program offerings in 2 ways. There would be an increase in arts integration and a decrease in arts taught for their own sake. And 2, secondly, an increase in after-school art programs and a decrease in art programs scheduled during the regular school day. In support of her back to the basics analysis of NCLB legislation, Laura states, "The rhetoric of the law is strictly academic, in quotation marks, rigorous, in quotation marks, and demanding, in quotation marks," coming directly from the bill. There is a mantra-like use of the term academic 811 times. As the all-purpose adjective, it summarizes a philosophy of education based on transmitting knowledge, especially book learning, rule and fact-bound, easily tested. Although the law, NCLB, can be said to include a few carrots for schools, it offered an elaborate array of sticks. Laura laments the rote learning, one-size-fits-all focus of NCLB. Within each state, content and achievement standards must be the same for all students, she says about the law. And then she states, best practices are aligned with national and state standards, as described in NCLB, scientifically proven to be effective and cost efficient and able to be applied, duplicated, and scaled up for wider use. This nicely echoes the idea that ready-made solutions are out there and that teachers aren't much more than the technicians who should use them. She early on called attention to subgroup scores being the demise of all public schools, while curricula are diminished to only knowable facts, saying statewide tests are required, the same for all, aligned with national and state standards, and 95% of students must take them. The whole school can be sanctioned if attendance is poor on test days. Only 1% of students with the most severe cognitive limitations are exempt. Students with limited proficiency in English are tested in their native language for 3 years. After that, they're expected to pass tests presented in English. Nationally, 20% of students speak a language other than English at home, and that percentage doubles in some states and is growing across the country. Tests can be norm or criteria referenced, uniquely developed for the state, in collaboration with others, or supplied by for-profit vendors. In fact, 3 companies, Harcourt, Pearson, and McGraw-Hill, are doing most of the scoring and testing. Tests may not assess personal beliefs or attitudes, or those of family members. Tests must offer an itemized score analysis so teaching can focus on, quote, the needs indicated by the items. That's just side of saying teach to the test to teachers out there in the land. Well, in my school system outside Washington, D.C., the domino effect was the opposite of Laura's prediction number 2, that the lowest achieving students would move to neighboring schools, thereby lowering the test scores of these schools, diminishing the chances of meeting AYP in a domino effect in schools. This is the only prediction of Laura's that I saw to be an experience to be different in our school system. And that is that parents had the right to move their students to one of the 2 closest neighboring schools when their schools failed. That was in the law. Parents with the knowledge and understanding of what was going on moved their high-achieving students, while left behind were lower-achieving children whose parents didn't speak English, didn't understand what was going on, or simply wished to stay in their home, neighborhood, public schools. Worse yet, teachers with the resumes, experience, and tenacity transferred to better performing schools, leaving behind poorer performing teachers, and then the new, inexperienced teachers hired to replace them. Eventually, once this trend was realized, incentives were given to both principals and teachers who taught in low-performing schools, and could bring up student scores. Typically, though, this strategy included diminishing the arts. Harken back to Laura's prediction number 1. Parents could follow their school's adequate yearly progress, or AYP, which Laura describes as a variant of the idea of continuous improvement in business. AYP functions as a pass-fail test for the whole school, she says. Why? Because strict annual increases in scores are expected, and there are penalties for the whole school if any subgroup fails to make their adequate yearly progress. Laura goes on to describe subgroups, saying, it works like this. For AYP, test scores are disaggregated, meaning that in unparalleled detail, scores are tracked in relation to race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status, attendance, mobility, special education, limited English proficiency, qualifications of teachers, and much more. In combination, Laura states there are 120 levels of data disaggregated and available to analyze. She then states that these requirements spawned a growth industry and huge investments in software for tracking performance from the classroom level up the line. Here trouble spots appear in red on this graphic, and this is created by Laura, of course. Yellow is for watch out, and green is good news in terms of AYP, and red for any subgroup means the whole school is in trouble with AYP. This information was highly published and was followed by parents. And I should say the chart was not developed by Laura. Each one of these images that I'm showing you that come from Laura's presentation were photographically shot from charts, newspaper articles, and also from the slides that she created to look like they were PowerPoint presentation slides. Well, Laura goes on to state, measures of AYP are summarized in report cards, and these must be highly publicized. Comparisons are made among students, teachers of the same subject and grade and their students, and then among schools in a district, then among schools in a state, allowing for state-by-state comparisons with scores on the National Assessment of Educational Progress. Is it any wonder that there was movement among principals, teachers, and students by their well-informed parents, leaving schools more homogenized than ever before? Well, here's Laura's third prediction, a decrease in explicitly taught thinking skills and an increase in lowest common denominator teaching to the test right answers. In my last year before retiring from James Madison University in 2020, I had undergraduate students whose entire schooling experience from kindergarten on had been under the No Child Left Behind educational atmosphere. Is it any wonder, then, that students simply wanted to be told right answers in my classes so that they could be ready for a test, as if the world operated in black and white without the nuances of gray, not to mention living color? In my Fairfax County school experience, an even uglier example of dumbing down curricula and preparing students for rote learning came in the form of a teacher training that I had initiated and then observed. Think blocks were originally invented by Cornell University professor Derek Cabrera, internationally known for his work in systems thinking research, to teach his graduate and doctoral students systems thinking at Cornell. My good friend and art resource teacher at the elementary level in Fairfax County Public Schools, Ann Erickson, had become enamored with think blocks in the early 2000s as a possible way to have elementary students who struggle with mind mapping see how the process could work through 3D manipulation. Think blocks are simply nesting blocks of varieties of sizes to which are assigned ideas with an erasable marker. At that time, the blocks were opaque, but today's think blocks are transparent, so you can look through to see what ideas nest inside of larger or bigger ideas. Brainstormed ideas could be written in dry erase marker, as I've said, on the outside of the blocks, and then nesting related ideas in diminishing significance from big ideas to details in the same category was the objective. And then kind of mixing and matching. No, this block fits better over here. This block fits better in here. This is a bigger idea. It needs to be separated out with its details added over here. So it was a way of mind mapping in three-dimensional form. Well, in 2004-2005, Ann and I made arrangements for all of our elementary art teachers in Fairfax County Public Schools, which at that time I would say was about 150 elementary art teachers. We had Professor Cabrera and one of his graduate students come to Fairfax County to train those art teachers. Well, our coordinator of elementary instruction also attended this training and extended the contract of Dr. Cabrera to train all kindergarten teachers in the county. Well, I had to miss the elementary art teacher training due to another commitment, so I sat in while a group of kindergarten teachers was trained. After Dr. Cabrera had explained the think block process, 3 kindergarten teachers and I experimented with nesting think block ideas at our table. At one point, one of the teachers exclaimed, "This is fun. We used to do this kind of thing with our students all the time." I said, "What? Have your students think creatively?" She said, "Yes. Now we have to get our students ready for state testing. We don't have time for this kind of activity." So I queried, "In kindergarten? Students aren't tested until 3rd grade. What about play? What about group dynamics? What about keeping their hands to themselves and not pushing? What about independent and group thinking?" No, she said. "We have to make sure the students are prepared by the 3rd grade." She lamented, to which other teachers agreed, the other 2 teachers at our table. Well, I knew then that schools, children, and especially the arts were in deep trouble. As Laura pointed out, originally the law authorized programs that integrate the arts into the curriculum, saying, "This language acknowledges that the arts are not really part of the regular curriculum. We don't have to talk about integrating math, reading, science into the curriculum." And then she goes on to say that the arts have since been cut on the grounds that the Bush administration has a policy of terminating small categorical programs with limited impact in order to fund higher priorities. The arts, Laura pointed out, can be included in other programs such as after-school enrichment aimed at reducing dropouts and improving AYP. For arts magnet schools, the clear priorities are for improvements in reading, math, and science. Advanced placement courses must focus on the core academic subjects of English, math, and science. And Laura argued that what should be more fully publicized is the impact of what's taught and what is not. Political posturing that the arts and other subjects are core is disingenuous, she says, when only 3 subjects count. In a recent survey, she stated, 43% of teachers reported they had decreased a great deal the time spent teaching fine arts, with greatest impact on the elementary schools and then middle schools. Well, here's Laura's prediction number 4. Public schools in general will fail in pursuit of No Child Left Behind goals. These goals, the goals as they have been established, are statistically unachievable. NCLB goals are statistically unachievable. And so here's the prediction that most caught our attention in Denver, and the one that got our superintendent and our school board's attention at the Kennedy Center. Laura makes her point. At the first level is a school in need of improvement, dubbed such because it has failed to make AYP for 2 consecutive years. It is notified before the beginning of the 3rd year and may operate during the 3rd year, during which time it has 3 months to develop a 2-year improvement plan, identify the causes of failure to make AYP, compile scientific strategies for improving scores, and set new AYP targets for each subgroup that failed. In the meantime, these failing students have the option to transfer, as I described earlier, at district expense. If AYP is not made in the 4th year, the second level of consequences kicks in. Laura further explains. There's a whole typology of schools and education service providers buried deep in the law. First, a traditional public school is one that students attend by virtue of living in a zone that also forms a tax base for that district. An elected school board authorizes programs and has oversight of the schools, including magnet schools. Many schools get Title I funds for high priority students, but all traditional public schools are subject to AYP, which means even good schools face consequences if their scores decline. These consequences are spelled out in detail at least at these 3 levels of severity. Well, the school is now in need of corrective attention, meaning it has failed to make AYP after trying its improvement plan for 1 year. Corrective actions can be combined. The options are replacing the teacher of the students who didn't make AYP, replacing the entire curriculum with one that is scientifically based, reducing the choices of all staff, and hiring outside experts. Meanwhile, students have the option to transfer to a higher performing school and get tutoring at district expense. If corrective action does not produce AYP for 2 consecutive years, there is a 3rd level of consequences, which is the school is closed or totally restructured. It may reopen as a charter school or with replacements for all staff responsible for students who failed to make AYP, or with management by a for-profit company or the state. It is worth noting that AYP functions as a pass-fail test for the whole school, and with only 1 year to improve, even if you've made a 2-year plan. Well, what that means, Laura states, is that at a practical level, many schools are scrambling. They're in scramble mode with wall charts like the one we see here, tracking scores and setting AYP targets for each subgroup, and following state rules for that while frantically searching for those ready-to-use, scientifically based best practices for the coming year. Well, it was with this slide, both in Denver and in Washington, D.C., that I think we all sat up and paid attention. I know that my school system did. Laura cautions, but the race is rigged. The race was rigged because schools don't start at the same level. but it simply doesn't matter. Here, School A makes huge gains compared to School B, but neither school is on a path that will meet AYP in the 10-year span that needed to happen, according to No Child Left Behind. Actually, it was from 2001, 2002 to 2013, 2014. And this chart that Laura presented came from the president of the American Education Research Association, Robert Lynn. Laura believed then, as I did then and I do now, the demise of free public education was premeditated. She lists the alternatives of schools who are not being measured by AYP. Remember, this was only for public schools. A second kind of school defined in the law is a public charter school, technically open to all, tuition-free and secular. These are authorized by independent chartering agencies as allowed by state law. These schools were intended to be market-driven, as if there were people out there in the land that said, oh, this is a good business plan. They are self-forming, Laura says. They govern themselves with some oversight by the chartering agency. Under NCLB, state law must be changed if charter schools aren't yet permitted, or if per-pupil subsidies for them aren't allowed. The law funds new charter schools for up to 3 years, including the cost of buildings or leasing buildings, salaries, instructional materials, and the like. Funds are also earmarked for bank-like entities that can manage investments exclusively for charter schools, such as lending money for their operation. Charter schools survive by the level of demand for them and the satisfaction of their customers. They advertise for students and teachers who are not typically under union contracts. Charter schools are free of AYP and many other requirements of the law if the charter agency provides waivers, A, or if B, the Secretary of Education unilaterally offers exemptions, in effect, bypassing state law. And then there's private schools. They're also a part of the typology of schools. The law requires that funds for neutral, secular, and non-ideological programs in public schools must be offered to private schools in proportion to students eligible for them. Although private schools may be secular or religious, funds may not be used for religious instruction. Even so, the definition of when a program does or does not support religious instruction is not legally clear. In any case, private schools are also free of AYP and scientific best practices as promoted by NCLB. And then the typology extends to for-profit ventures, also known as education service providers, including franchise schools, school management companies, online education, and tutoring services. All can receive funds if they meet state and federal law bearing on individuals with disabilities, civil rights, and so on. They can bypass teachers' unions and are free of adequate yearly progress goals and scientific best practices. Remember, it was only the public schools that needed to meet the NCLB standards. And then finally, Laura states, faith-based initiatives are part of the Bush agenda, and some programs are not only qualify for grants, but novice applicants get preferential treatment. Of these programs, funded at $2.7 billion in the year 2002, Laura points out, only one calls for best practices. It is not generally known that all faith-based programs can bypass federal and state law bearing on non-discrimination in their employment. As the timeline illustrates, the pressure to score high on tests is great. And the timeline is the chart I previously showed. The pressure to score high on tests is great. In North Carolina, 80% of elementary teachers reported they spent 6 to 7 weeks preparing for tests, and taking tests may preempt another full week because some take 17 hours distributing over several days. You've got about 7 months before all test prep takes over, and it's a preoccupation before then. Well, for me, even in the past year, 9 years past the deadline of No Child Left Behind, one of my teacher neighbors recommended that the school year should end once state tests have been taken, since, she stated, the rest of the school year is a waste of time. Is it any wonder, then, that Gallup polls continue to show the decline in America's confidence in their public schools, and from all sides of any political polarity? Laura saw it all so clearly and stated it so succinctly in 2004. Her predictions all have come to pass. In closing, Laura pleads for the continuance of the American dream and a free public education for all students. She states, "The law is the most extensive and the most costly experiment in the history of American education, and is also proceeding in the absence of rigorous scientific evidence in support of it. I am convinced," she says, "I am committed to public schools, and within them some balance among studies of the arts, sciences, and humanities. Given the real prospect of the lost or atrophied curriculum in the next decade, I urge others who share that commitment to closely monitor, report on, and resist policies that demean the arts and studies of them, along with studies in the humanities. In my judgment," she says, "that's precisely what the law authorizes and promotes, among much else." And then she closes with, "Silence from within and beyond the profession becomes an unspoken endorsement of an extremely narrow view of education, as training leaving no child behind on the assembly line." Well, whether premeditated or not, No Child Left Behind has left us with a legacy of the decline of public schools in the eyes of all Americans, with the predominant curriculum of teach to the test, only one right answer, rote learning at the expense of creative thinking and expression, critical analysis, and a well-rounded liberal arts education for all students. Laura's legacy is one of fearless opposition to the demise of a public school education and continuous promotion of an education in the arts for all students. All students. We honor Laura's memory by paying attention to policies that diminish these rights, speaking out about them, paying attention to them, clearly and articulately stating their dangers, and working diligently to keep ourselves and others informed while doing our very best to make positive change for all students in our country. I am so grateful for the mentoring of Dr. Laura Chapman. She is a heroine of the arts, but also of public education in general. Her career stands as a legacy of energy in the arts, deeming no task to be too big to take on. Yet no detail is too small to deserve her attention. With a willingness to give freely of her time and energy to anyone who asked. I am so glad I asked. Laura Chapman is my hero. I hope she's your hero too, and we help her legacy to live on. Thank you all very much.